What happens when grief refuses to stay private? When mourning becomes public scrutiny? When the loss of a spouse is not the closing of a chapter, but the opening of a far more painful one? For Shirley Caesar, grief didn't arrive quietly. It didn't sit politely in the back pew and wait its turn. It arrived loud, disruptive, and uninvited, wrapped in suspicion, accusation, and doubt. In 2014, after more than 30 years of marriage, Shirley Caesar buried her husband. To the outside world, it appeared to be a solemn but dignified farewell, one chapter ending, another beginning. But beneath the surface, something else was already forming. Instead of rest, she found resistance. Instead of comfort, confrontation. Instead of unity, fracture. And the questions came quickly. How does a woman known for preaching honesty suddenly find herself questioned about integrity? How does admiration flip so easily into doubt? And why do accusations so often follow loss? When silence doesn't last. For most widows, the weeks after a funeral are quiet. Visitors taper off. Cards stop arriving. Life begins to reset itself slowly, painfully. For Shirley, the silence barely existed. Whispers started first. Quiet, almost polite. Family members raised concerns about her late husband's estate. Questions about finances. About decisions made years earlier. About money that had moved hands without clear explanation. At first, these concerns remained behind closed doors. But closed doors don't stay shut forever. Not when grief, money, and history collide. Soon, rumors found oxygen. And once they did, they grew. Then came the headline that stunned even her longest supporters. Allegations that Shirley Caesar had taken more than $2 million from her own church. $2 million. To some, the number alone made the story irresistible. To others, it felt impossible. Was this the same woman who preached accountability from the pulpit? The same voice that sang about sacrifice and humility? The same figure who had spent decades urging others to live upright lives? Or had people misunderstood her all along? The weight of a name. To understand why these accusations hit so hard, you have to understand what the name Shirley Caesar meant long before 2014. It wasn't just a brand. It wasn't just a career. It was a testimony built over decades. One sermon, one song, one decision at a time. And that story doesn't begin with fame. It begins in a small house in Durham, North Carolina. A house full of sound. Shirley and Caesar was born on October 13, 1938, into a family of 13 children. 13 mouths to feed. 13 personalities. 13 futures waiting to unfold. Money was scarce. Privacy was non-existent. But the house was never quiet. Music lived there. Gospel melodies floated through narrow hallways, spilled from open windows, and followed the family wherever they went. Her father, James Caesar, known to everyone as Big Jim, worked long hours at a tobacco factory. But when the workday ended, his real calling began. At night, he led gospel groups. He rehearsed at home. He sang with conviction, not for applause but for purpose. Neighbors didn't need invitations. They came anyway. What does it do to a child to grow up where faith isn't whispered, but sung out loud? Where belief isn't abstract, but practiced daily? For Shirley, it became oxygen. She watched how her father held a note. How he paused before delivering a lyric. How he let emotion sit in silence before sound returned. Without realizing it, she was studying ministry long before she understood the word. The day the music stopped. Then, in 1950, everything changed. Shirley was only 7 years old when her father died suddenly from a seizure. One moment the house was alive with harmony. The next, it was hollow. The loss didn't just remove a parent, it removed the anchor of the family. But what haunted Shirley most wasn't just the absence. It was the guilt. Earlier that day, her father had disciplined her. In the logic only a child can carry, Shirley began to believe that his death was connected to that moment. Punishment. Consequence. Fault. No one corrected that belief strongly enough. And so it stayed. How many adults are still carrying stories they never meant to keep? How many destinies are shaped by misunderstandings formed too young to name? That guilt followed her quietly for years, shaping her urgency, her seriousness, her devotion. Growing up too soon. With Big Jim gone, responsibility fell fast and heavy. Her mother, Shirley Caesar, lived with a disability and now faced the impossible task of raising 13 children alone. Shirley didn't have the luxury of prolonged childhood. She cooked. She cleaned. She helped raise her siblings. And she sang. Her voice wasn't just beautiful. It was necessary. It helped bring in money. It filled spaces where comfort was needed. It reminded people that something sacred still existed in a house marked by loss. Church became more than worship. It became safety. More than belief. Structure. More than routine. Refuge. By 8, Shirley was already performing solos. By 10, she was traveling with gospel quartets across the Carolinas. People didn't just listen. They felt something. Who was this child with a voice that carried so much weight? A child on television. In her early teens, Shirley began traveling with evangelist Leroy Johnson. His television program introduced her to audiences far beyond church walls. For a young black girl in the segregated South, this kind of exposure was rare. And it taught her something vital. How do you speak to people you can't see? How do you connect when the audience is invisible? Television demanded clarity, conviction, confidence. It sharpened her ability to communicate emotion without physical presence, a skill that would later define her ministry. At 13, she recorded her first single, I'd Rather Jesus. Most teenagers were navigating adolescence. Shirley was navigating destiny, torn between paths. She enrolled at North Carolina Central College to study business education. Practical, grounded, sensible. But something inside her resisted settling into an ordinary life. Then came the moment that redefined everything. During a typing exam, she heard her name called. Clearly, audibly. No one around her had spoken. Later, alone in her room, the voice returned, telling her she had been called before birth to preach. Was it spiritual revelation? Inner clarity? The culmination of years of formation? Whatever it was, Shirley didn't ignore it. She left college and chose ministry, the Caravans and the making of a force. At 19, she approached Albertina Walker, leader of the legendary gospel group the Caravans. Walker recognized her immediately. Joining the group transformed Shirley from prodigy into powerhouse. But she didn't blend in, she stood out. She didn't just sing. She spoke. She added short sermon-like reflections between verses. She shared testimony. She exposed vulnerability. Some didn't like it. Others couldn't get enough. Audiences felt seen, understood, addressed. After 8 years, Shirley made a decision that could have ended everything. She left. Why leave security? Why walk away from acclaim? Why risk it all? Because she believed the calling required it. Building a legacy from scratch. Forming the Shirley Caesar Singers wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting. Hundreds of engagements. Endless travel. Small churches. Large revivals. Late nights. Early mornings. She gave everything she had. And in 1972, the industry took notice. Her first Grammy Award confirmed what audiences already knew. Still, she didn't slow down. She earned a degree in business administration, believing faith and discipline belonged together. Her song No Charge crossed into mainstream charts, touching families far beyond church walls. But success brought temptation. Record labels wanted crossover appeal. Bigger markets. Bigger money. She refused. Was relevance worth compromise? Was popularity worth dilution? For Shirley, the answer was no. Ministry and marriage. In 1983, she married Bishop Harold Ivory Williams. Together, they pastored Mount Calvary Word of Faith Church in Raleigh. Her sermons addressed real life, not abstract theology. Bills, marriage, pain, loss, hope. For decades, her life appeared steady, purposeful, grounded. Until 2014. When the storm came. Her husband's death cracked something open. Family disputes emerged. Questions multiplied. Rumors escalated. Then came the accusation. $2 million. The internet did what it does best. Reacted first. Investigated later. An audit eventually cleared her of wrongdoing. But in the age of viral headlines, truth rarely arrives first. How much damage can a rumor do before facts arrive? How quickly can decades of service be overshadowed by a single allegation? What legacy really means? Shirley Caesar's story isn't one of perfection. It's one of endurance, calling, consistency. So what do we learn? Is legacy defined by crisis, or by decades of commitment? Do we judge faster than we understand? And how much grace do we extend when public figures are at their most vulnerable? Perhaps the real question isn't whether Shirley survived the storm, but whether we are willing to look beyond headlines and remember the full journey. Because sometimes, the loudest accusations arrive only after a life has already given everything it had. The lights in the Duke Energy Center for the Performing Arts dimmed slowly, as if the room itself were taking a breath before something holy. Some people bowed their heads. Others sat forward, eyes bright with expectation. For many who had come from as far as 2 states away, Shirley Caesar was not just an artist on a stage. She was a ledger of lives, the hymns of weddings, the laments at funerals, the soundtracks for Sunday mornings and sleepless nights. To step into the hall that evening in 2022 was, for them, to step into a memory. Shirley walked on without fanfare. No dramatic flounce, no theatrical entrance, just a woman in a modest dress, hair carefully arranged, hands steady at her sides. Yet when she opened her mouth, decades of voice work, hundreds of tours, pulpit hours, bedside prayers, unspooled into the theater. Sound is not only measurement, it is history folded into air. Her voice carried more than notes. It carried a life. You could feel how the notes landed on the room, soft at first, then building into a river of sound strong enough to erode doubt. That relentless, steady faith had been Shirley's practice for 70 years. To sing truth until truth became a living thing for others. The applause was sincere, but in those quiet minutes between verses, the room felt less like an auditorium and more like a sanctuary whose walls remembered every sermon, every funeral, every wedding. If one wanted to trace a life by its landmarks, Shirley's would be mapped not only by accolades but by the slow accretion of small acts. Her church was not merely a Sunday stop for the faithful. It was a municipal artery for the city. What began as a place to sing and pray became a center where hunger was met, practical needs were mitigated, and grief was shared. Volunteers who distributed food boxes knew the names of regular attendees. They remembered children who grew up under the ministry's wing and returned years later with babies of their own. The annual Christmas giveaway, by 2024, served more than 1,000 people. Food lines formed in precise order. Volunteers joked with older patrons about where they'd parked. The event was logistical theater and sacrament. Why does this matter? Because it shows what a life of faith looked like when practiced as habit, not as headline. She believed you could not separate worship from work, praise from practice. That cup and ocean metaphor she often used, "I can't sweeten the whole Atlantic, but I can make a cup sweeter," was not a throwaway line, it was a daily ethic. It gave her parishioners permission to do small things faithfully and to accept small help without shame. The leap from pulpit to public office surprised some. The gospel, for many, is separate from civic life, a private compass instead of a public map. But for Shirley, there was no clear line. When she ran for Durham City Council in 1987, she did not don a politician's suit and rehearsed slogans. Instead, she spoke plainly about affordable housing, livelihoods, and care for seniors, the same concerns she had spent decades addressing from the pulpit. Friends warned that politics could bruise a minister's reputation. Others suspected that voters might feel uneasy electing a gospel star. She listened, weighed counsel, and then did what she had always done: she showed up. Election night was less about confetti and more about neighbors waiting in a community center with fried chicken, sweet tea, and weary hope. When the results arrived, the room surged like a choir: relief, gratitude, a tangible sense that someone they trusted would sit at the city's table and speak for them. Her agenda in office was unspectacular but stubbornly practical. She pushed measures that prioritized renters, created job training programs, and kept a focus on seniors who lived on fixed incomes. She would sit in meetings, sometimes the long, dry, technocratic meetings that exhausted even seasoned activists, and she would ask a simple, piercing question. How will this help the mother who's choosing between medicine and groceries? It was a question that made policy feel human again. Politics did not make her popular in every corner. She was criticized, as most public figures are, but she did not court controversy for its own sake. Her decisions, even the unpopular ones, were rooted in the same ethic that guided her ministry: service to the needful. That ethic followed her beyond the council chamber. When she sang in the White House for presidents and first ladies starting with Jimmy Carter, she understood that stages could amplify a voice of conscience as well as a voice of praise. At the Obama celebration in 2015, she did not offer only sweetness. She infused her set with songs that named justice and pain and the dignity owed to those on the margins. Those moments, staggering honors that placed her on the national stage, never made her forget the community center back home. And yet honors cannot armor someone from grief. On July 4, 2014, the day of celebration for many, her life shifted into a season of silence. The death of Bishop Harold Ivory Williams, her husband of 31 years, cracked open a private night that had to be navigated by daylight. They had been co-pastors, partners in ministry and life, both known for tenacity and conviction. Their church conducted its rituals as always, but now those rituals had to be carried by one of them alone. The funeral was full, loud with memories and testimony, stories of sermons that changed minds, of counseling sessions that turned to life. But once the pulpit lights dimmed and the last line of hymn was sung, Shirley walked out through doors into a world where the person who had shared the floor in quiet moments was no longer there. How does someone continue the work they have been doing as a team when the other half is gone? How do you hold a congregation's grief while your own is raw and aching? She would come to know what many widows and widowers know, that public loss and private loss can be different languages. Legal battles followed, complicated, sharp, leaking into a public sphere that loves tidy narratives more than nuance. Disputes about Bishop Williams's estate and church governance became gossip fodder. For Shirley, the wounds were not only financial or legal. They were intimate, the betrayal of trust, the discomfort of being accused, of being questioned, while still carrying memory of someone you loved. When children of her late husband contested aspects of the estate, the press delighted in framing the story as cleavage between new and old families, between ministry and management. Yet those headlines rarely reflected the landscape of mornings spent with coffee and prayer, of decisions made late at night over the phone, of the small domestic liturgies that hold a household together. Rumors metastasized in the dryness of social media. Claims she had misappropriated millions from the church, that she had stolen funds, that she had enriched herself while her flock suffered. It took an independent audit by Ernst & Young to set the record straight. 98% of donations used as intended, shortfalls covered by her own funds, but truth is not always viral. The corrections appeared below the fold. Accusations, slickly framed and spread with the speed of outrage, left marks that the audit could not erase entirely. How can one hold firm when the air around you is filled with falsehood? How do you find the courage to keep serving when serving itself becomes suspect? Shirley's response was, in public, a mix of calm indignation and relentless clerical routine. In private, she called friends and advisors, leaned on prayer, and continued to show up. The habit of service was itself a kind of armor. She believed that continued faithful action, feeding, clothing, sheltering, would, over time, speak more truth than any headline or audit. And then something stranger still happened. The rumor mill moved from accusations to a darker, more surreal space. A cascade of fake obituaries and posts about terminal illness surfaced in 2024 and 2025. At times, it landed like a weather system. People came to her home with flowers, some spoke aloud at the hospital as if already performing rites. Social media, hungry for drama, savored the image of a beloved figure gone too soon. She found herself forced to make videos in the simplest terms: "I am alive." The act of proving one's continued existence to an anxious world is almost absurd, yet it became part of her life. What does it do to a soul to be publicly mourned while still breathing? How do you explain grief that has been preempted? These were not merely rhetorical questions. They were daily realities. Messages from strangers, mourners who had not yet attended the funeral, congregants who needed reassurance. Physical tolls compounded these emotional labors. By the late 1980s, doctors had found nodules on her vocal cords. The work, the touring, the impassioned sermons had exacted a price. Steroid injections became part of a regimen that kept the voice functioning. Singing and speaking became acts of management, of dosage, of rest, of careful calibration. Yet when the call came to record a live album in Chicago in 1989, she went anyway. The performance, wreathed in pain, produced art that many would later call timeless. Her acceptance speech at the Stellar Awards that year, soft, halting, revealed what fans had always suspected, that greatness often carries private strain. Then, in September 2025, something happened that even the most faithful could not ignore. At a public appearance, an event meant to celebrate and encourage, she collapsed. Cameras captured the moment. The clip looped across platforms, accompanied by a chorus of speculation. Hospitals released limited information. Friends and family urged privacy. 4 days. The modern world waited. When she returned home to rest, it felt like a collective exhale, but also like a reminder of mortality's claim on all of us. Would she slow down now? Would life impose a quieter rhythm? History suggested she would not yield easily. Within weeks she was back preaching, back in interviews, back to the practice she had honed. Prayer before sunrise, scripture read through each year, prayers rooms set up while traveling, mentoring younger artists. Her discipline was not discipline for its own sake. It was devotion encoded into habit. The 4 a.m. prayer time became almost mythic among those who studied her life. They imagined a woman alone in an otherwise sleeping house, a lamp on, a Bible open, and the steady rhythm of pages turning. In 2016, when a clip of "Hold My Mule" became an internet phenomenon, the "You Name It" challenge, an entire new generation discovered her. The line beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes landed inside a cultural moment that neither she nor her record label could have engineered. Social media remixed the clip into loops and jokes. For some artists, such virality can feel like theft. For Shirley, it was another opportunity. She navigated the legal issues that arose professionally and insisted on protecting her image, but she also asked, how could this sudden attention be redirected toward service? How could the meme be used to encourage young people to volunteer? She turned that moment into a bridge. When younger artists sampled her voice or sought counsel, she received them with a steady humility that belied the distance between their worlds. It is important to remember that Shirley's influence was not merely performative. She was a mentor. Yolanda Adams, Kirk Franklin, and other artists openly acknowledged her guidance. She taught technique, breath, vowel, phrasing, but she taught more, what it meant to use a gift. In rehearsals, she insisted on discipline. She would stop a singer mid-phrase and ask them what they were singing for. "Who are you trying to help with that note?" she would say, and the question would fold the individual back into the communal purpose of music. Still, the storms were not finished. Rumors repeated. Exhaustion came. Hospitalizations multiplied into a set of bruises against the narrative that anyone, even a living legend, is invulnerable. In a 2025 interview, she admitted to private struggles. Insomnia, loneliness, a sense that public perception sometimes swallowed the person. But she also insisted that integrity mattered. That when the cameras were off, the work could not be allowed to corrode into cynicism. She chose, each day, to continue. There were quieter scenes in her life that the headlines never covered. One afternoon in the church office, the HVAC groaned and a box fan hummed near the window. Shirley sat at a chipped wooden desk and wrote thank you notes for volunteers who had spent the morning sorting clothes. She wrote with the same deliberate care as when she preached. The notes were heartfelt. "Thank you for being faithful," she wrote to one woman who had organized food baskets for years. The woman, upon receiving the note, cried in private, tears that were a mix of gratitude and wonder. These moments, small as they were, kept the ministry from becoming a brand. They tethered it to people. Another scene, a young singer, raw and lit with nerves, came to Shirley for coaching. She listened, corrected posture, warmed vocal technique, but then leaned in with a softness that made the singer's shoulders drop. "You must remember," she said, "gift is a trust. Use it to lift someone." The young artist left with practical notes and a new sense of obligation. An obligation that was a kind of love. Of course, the life of a public woman often felt like a palimpsest, layers written on top of layers. The accolades, 11 Grammys, dozens of other awards, a Hollywood Walk of Fame star, were real, luminous marks. Yet they were not the whole story. Behind them were long hours of rehearsal, nights alone in hotel rooms, telephones that sometimes offered only bad news. She had conversations with producers about image, with church staff about finance, with family about future plans. Each was a negotiation of values. When the internet's hunger for scandal collided with the human need for context, the result was often messy. False reports about her death or illness caused waves of grief that she had to soothe. People send flowers to the wrong address. Friends were invited to vigils without knowing whether those vigils were for the living or the dead. It was a strange inversion. People felt the permission to mourn a living person's loss because a post told them it was true. And so she learned to cultivate patience. Not the passive waiting kind, but a patience thick with labor. The patience of continued service in the face of noise. During one summer food drive, a volunteer asked her why she kept doing it, why she didn't retire and let someone younger take over. The question was not unkind, only practical. Shirley looked at him, at the faces of the families in line, and then at the children who came to help and learned what service looked like. "I can't stop," she said. "Not when there are mouths to feed, and not when there are hands to teach." This persistence was, for some, stubbornness. For others, fidelity. It became complicated when a pastor's health or the responsibilities of an aging leader require transition. Younger ministers sometimes asked whether her hold on leadership made it more difficult for new voices to emerge. She, with characteristic openness, encouraged mentorship. She looked for opportunities to elevate trusted leaders, to share the pulpit, to empower. But she also felt keenly the special intimacy of a congregation that had walked with her through decades of life's turnings. That intimacy created a sense of responsibility she could not easily set down. Every life is full of paradox, and hers was no exception. She had been deeply loved and deeply tested. She had been honored and accused. Fame had brought access, rooms where decisions were made, microphones where the vulnerable were given a voice, and it had also brought scrutiny so intense it sometimes felt like an occupational hazard. She faced a public that wanted big statements and private moments that needed tenderness. Through it all, certain rituals kept her centered. She read the Bible cover to cover every year. She began each day before dawn in prayer. She kept a small room in her home for meditation, a place where she could be alone with scripture and the hush of mourning. Her staff joked about the precision of her schedule. She joked back that discipline was a love language. Those early mornings were not performance or piety. They were what allowed her to keep showing up. Mentoring remained central to her legacy. She insisted that younger artists understand the intersection of excellence and humility. She reminded them that gift without service becomes a kind of vanity. She told stories of singers who had spectacular technique but lacked the spiritual and emotional accountability that made music useful. "You can sing high notes and nobody will be changed," she would say. "But if the song reaches someone who thought they had no hope, then that's worth everything." Those she mentored remember more than her voice. They remember the way she insisted they bring their whole selves into their work, their struggles, their contradictions, their joys. She was not a moralistic drill sergeant but a careful gardener, pruning, encouraging, and creating space for growth. The question of legacy is an old one, and she faced it with both humility and calculation. She understood that monuments are brittle things. A hymn book, a plaque, a star on a walk cannot hold a life. What carries forward are practices. The habit of daily prayer, the insistence on feeding the hungry, the discipline of showing up. She asked herself in private, how to translate decades of service into structures that could survive her absence. How would the ministry continue to meet needs? Who would be prepared to run the food programs? Which staff members had the administrative competence to steward a legacy without ossifying it? She used her platforms, interviews, concerts, awards, to model these questions rather than answer them for others. She founded training programs, encouraged succession planning, and insisted on financial transparency. When the audit challenges had surfaced, she saw them not only as personal affronts but as clarion calls. If your system is not transparent, rumor finds purchase. If your bureaucracy lacks competence, someone else will exploit the gap. There is no romanticism in running a ministry well. There is only necessary mundane work, accounting, continuity planning, archives of records. One of the most vivid scenes from the later years was a small rehearsal before a recording session. Engineers fussed with cables. A young keyboardist asked for advice about chord voicings. Shirley, who had sung gospel for decades, listened and then nodded, offering a line that was as much about music as it was about life. Make the harmony not to impress, but to hold. The room laughed, but the phrase, make the harmony to hold, became, for those present, a concise dictum for ministry itself. The harmony should not be spectacle. It should be a support. As she grew older, her reflections deepened. She spoke in interviews about the paradox of celebrity. Doors open, yes, but often to rooms where other people's agendas are at play. She spoke candidly about her regrets, not shocking scandals, but quieter remorse for things not done. Time not taken, conversations delayed, moments of mercy missed because she was rushing to the next engagement. These confessions did not diminish her. They humanized her. And she never stopped asking questions. Who benefits from this program? Is this decision rooted in the dignity of the people we serve? How do we teach generosity to young people who have never had to worry about where the next meal will come from? These questions framed her work in a future-oriented way. She was interested not only in what comfort she provided today, but in how the next generation would learn to tend to one another. The viral meme era provided an unexpected instrument for that pedagogy. When a clip remixed into millions of lines of code and dance, she used it to open conversations about art and charity. If they laugh at the clip, she said in a televised interview, let them laugh and then ask them to volunteer. And some did. The internet's hunger for novelty produced, in certain corners, an appetite for purpose. In the end, the measure of her life returned to the people who lined up at the church for food donations, the young artists who sought counsel, the volunteers who spent long weekends packaging boxes, the families who hung on after midnight to hear a prayer. Headlines might record scandals and audits and viral clips. They might sensationalize and oversimplify. But in the kitchens where pots were ladled into plastic tubs, in the rooms where a mentor held a nervous hand, in the quiet mornings when a woman in a lamplit room turned pages of scripture, there, legacy was being lived. If history asks what to remember, the question is not rhetorical. Which will outlast the noise? The momentary headline, or the decades of quietly regulated care? Would future historians choose a clip or a carefully kept ledger of meals served? Will they notice the stories of people whose lives were altered? Seniors who could pay a medical bill because of an assistance program, teenagers who avoided prison because of a youth outreach, single mothers who found safe housing because of persistent advocacy? Shirley's life suggests an answer. The noise is loud, but it is also fickle. It spins quickly and then fades. Service, even when small, stretches longer. A cup may never sweeten an ocean, but a cup shared repeatedly becomes a river of habit. When people ask what to learn from her, one can point to awards and viral clips and courtroom battles. But perhaps the clearest lesson lies in the simple ritual of rising early, reading scripture, and answering the phone when someone needs help. Near the end of a long day, Shirley once sat on a plain bench behind the sanctuary, where a thin shaft of light came through a stained glass window. She did not make a speech. She simply watched volunteers carry boxes into cars. A little boy waved from the back seat of his mother's sedan, a brown box of food between his knees. He grinned like a secret had been shared. For a moment the adult world fell away, and all that mattered was the boy's grin and the fact that someone had chosen to show up. What will history remember? Will it remember the allegations and the screams of rumor? Or will it remember the way a woman chose, again and again, to come early, to stay late, to make a cup sweeter wherever she could? In the end, perhaps the more important question is this. What will we choose to remember about our own lives, our headlines, or our cups? Shirley Caesar's story is not an answer so much as a map, one that points to the ordinary, persistent choices that make an extraordinary life. It teaches that a voice can be an instrument of solace and protest, that fame can be a tool for service, and that legacy is built less by the shimmer of awards than by the long arithmetic of faithful acts. It urges us to ask uncomfortable questions, to practice modest kindnesses, and to resist the cheap logic of rumor. And when the final measure is taken, when historians tally the sums of impact and vanity, will they find that courage matters more than acclaim? Will they note that the person who refused to stop singing also refused to stop serving? If there is a single clear verdict from decades of Shirley Caesar's life, it may be this, that the habits of care, the daily liturgies of service, and the disciplined prayer of a single woman can carry more truth into the world than any headline ever could. So when we remember her, what will we choose to hold? Her voice on a steamed stage, the newspaper columns, or the careful hands passing out a box of food to a child who needed it? The answer may not be dramatic. It may simply be a decision to measure our lives not by noise but by the small, steady waters we pour into other people's cups.